There is something deeply unsettling about bureaucracy applied to human beings. Not the violence of war, which is horrifying in its immediacy, but the cold, measured, clipboard-in-hand process of deciding who deserves to reproduce, who qualifies as valuable enough to carry the next generation, and who does not. That specific horror, the horror of selection, of criteria, of racial spreadsheets and medical examinations applied to human wombs, is what we are going to explore today. The program we are talking about is called Lebensborn, which translates from German as Fount of Life or Spring of Life. It was one of the most disturbing social engineering experiments in modern history, and yet it remains surprisingly misunderstood. Popular culture has turned it into a kind of mythological Nazi baby factory, a place where officers and selected women were brought together in some kind of orchestrated breeding operation. The reality, as historians have documented extensively, is both more complex and in many ways more chilling than the myth. To understand how women were selected for this program, we first need to understand the ideological world that produced it. Because Lebensborn did not emerge from nowhere, it was the logical endpoint of ideas that had been circulating in Europe and North America for decades before Adolf Hitler ever came to power. The late 19th century gave birth, if you will excuse the term, to the science of eugenics. The word itself was coined by Francis Galton, a British scientist and cousin of Charles Darwin, in 1883. Galton believed that human intelligence and character were hereditary traits, and that society could be improved by encouraging the right people to reproduce and discouraging or preventing the wrong people from doing so. His book Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, published that same year, laid out the theoretical framework for what would become one of the most catastrophic intellectual movements of the 20th century. Galton's ideas were not considered fringe. They were embraced by universities, by governments, by respected scientists across the Western world. The United States had its own robust eugenics movement, which resulted in forced sterilization laws in more than 30 states. Indiana became the first state to pass a compulsory sterilization law in 1907. The Supreme Court upheld such laws in the 1927 case Buck v. Bell, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writing that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This is documented history, not a footnote. Germany took these ideas and supercharged them with racial ideology. The Nazis did not invent eugenics, but they industrialized it, embedding it into state policy, into medicine, into education, and ultimately into a program designed not just to prevent undesirable reproduction, but to actively promote and engineer what they considered desirable reproduction. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was obsessed with this project. He believed that the Germanic or Nordic race was in demographic danger, that the best Germans were having fewer children while others reproduced more freely. His solution was to create institutional infrastructure that would support and encourage racially qualified women to have children, particularly children fathered by SS men, whom the Nazi regime considered the racial elite of Germany. This was the world that made Lebensborn possible, a world where science had been corrupted into ideology, where medicine had been weaponized as a tool of state racial policy, and where the most intimate human act, bringing a child into the world, had been transformed into a question of bureaucratic qualification. If this is the first time you are hearing about some of these details, you are in the right place. Stay with this because what comes next gets significantly more complicated and significantly more important to understand. To understand the selection criteria used in Lebensborn, you need to understand the man who designed it. Heinrich Himmler is often described as the architect of the Holocaust, but he was also the architect of its ideological mirror image, the attempt to produce more of what he considered the racially superior human type. Himmler was born in Munich in 1900 to a middle-class Catholic family. He studied agronomy, the science of soil management and crop production, and this agricultural background profoundly shaped his worldview. He thought about human beings the way a farmer thinks about livestock, in terms of breeding lines, genetic stock, and the cultivation of desirable traits. This was not a metaphor for Himmler. It was literally how he conceived of human reproduction policy. By 1929, Himmler had risen to lead the SS, which at that point was a small personal bodyguard unit for Hitler. He transformed it into a racial elite, an order modeled partly on medieval chivalric orders but filtered through Nazi racial ideology. Every SS man was required to prove his racial purity back several generations, and marriage to a woman required approval from the SS Race and Settlement Main Office, known by its German acronym Russia, or Rasse- und Siedlungshauptamt. On December 13, 1935, Himmler established the Lebensborn Registered Association, formerly known as Lebensborn e.V. The founding document, which historians have analyzed extensively, reveals the dual purpose of the organization. First, it aimed to support racially and hereditarily valuable families with many children. Second, it aimed to care for racially and hereditarily valuable mothers whose children, expected to be of equally good blood, had been or were expected to be born outside of wedlock. That second point is crucial and often overlooked. Lebensborn was not primarily a forced breeding program in its original German conception. It was, in significant part, a welfare program for unmarried mothers who met racial criteria. This distinction matters enormously for understanding how it actually functioned, while also not minimizing the coercive and deeply disturbing elements that were absolutely present. Richard Overy, the British historian and author of The Dictators Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, published by W. W. Norton in 2004, has written extensively about how Nazi racial policy combined idealistic and coercive elements simultaneously. The welfare aspect was real. The coercion was also real. These two things coexisted within the same institutional framework. The historian Kersti Eriksson and Eva Simonson edited a volume called Children of World War II, The Hidden Enemy Legacy, published by Berg Publishers in 2005, which contains detailed scholarly analysis of Lebensborn operations across multiple countries. Their work, along with that of German historian Georg Lilienthal, whose book Der Lebensborn wie ein Instrument nationalsozialistischer Rassenpolitik, published by Campus Verlag in 1985, represents some of the most rigorous historical scholarship on the program. Lilienthal's research, in particular, is foundational. He analyzed the SS records that survived the war, the internal documents of the Russia, the correspondence between Himmler's office and the individual Lebensborn homes, and what these documents reveal about the selection process is methodically disturbing in its bureaucratic precision. Himmler wanted to create a new German aristocracy, not based on inherited wealth or noble title, but on what he believed were inherited biological qualities. The SS man was to be the model of this new aristocracy, and the women who bore SS children were to be carefully selected to match. This meant that the selection criteria were not arbitrary. They were codified, documented, and enforced through institutional mechanisms. So what exactly were the criteria? How did a woman qualify for the Lebensborn program? The answer requires walking through a system that was simultaneously pseudoscientific and devastatingly concrete in its application. The primary document governing female admission to Lebensborn homes was the application form developed by the SS Race and Settlement Main Office. Women seeking admission, whether married or unmarried, had to submit to a comprehensive evaluation that covered three broad categories: racial appearance, hereditary health, and personal character. Let us start with racial appearance, because this is where the most viscerally disturbing pseudoscience was applied. Nazi racial ideology divided humanity into a hierarchy of racial types, with the so-called Nordic type at the top. This Nordic type was characterized by specific physical measurements, a system derived from the earlier work of anthropologists who had developed skull measurement techniques, known as craniometry, in the 19th century. The physical criteria included measurements of skull shape, the cephalic index, which measured the ratio of skull width to skull length. A skull that was long and narrow was considered Nordic. The measurements included facial features, specifically the angle and prominence of the nose, the shape of the jaw, and the width of the forehead. Eye color was recorded, with blue and gray eyes rated most favorably. Hair color and texture were documented, with light hair preferred, though dark-haired Europeans could still qualify if other racial markers were considered favorable. Skin color, height, and body proportions were all evaluated. Women were expected to be what the SS evaluators described as racially homogeneous, meaning their features should conform consistently to the Nordic, or at minimum the phallic or dinaric racial types recognized within Nazi racial taxonomy, rather than showing what they called mixed characteristics. Now, it is essential to say this clearly: this entire evaluative framework was scientifically fraudulent. Race science in this form has no basis in genuine biology or genetics. Modern genomics has established beyond any serious scholarly doubt that the racial categories constructed by 19th and early 20th century anthropologists do not correspond to discrete biological groupings in the human species. The work of geneticists like Luca Cavalli Sforza, detailed in his landmark, The History and Geography of Human Genes, published by Princeton University Press in 1994, demolished the biological foundations of the racial typology the Nazis applied. But the evaluators applying these criteria were not operating in a world of modern genetics. They were applying what they believed was rigorous science, and the consequences for real women being evaluated were entirely real, regardless of the fraudulent foundation. The hereditary health criteria required women to provide documentation of their family medical history, going back multiple generations. The Nazi regime had, by 1933, already established genetic health courts, Gesundheitsgerichte, which adjudicated forced sterilization cases. The Lebensborn application process drew on this same institutional infrastructure of hereditary health assessment. Disqualifying hereditary conditions, as defined by the 1933 law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, included schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's disease, hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, severe alcoholism, and what the law called hereditary physical deformity. Women with family histories of these conditions, as interpreted by Nazi medicine, were rejected. The Jewish family heritage was an absolute disqualifier. Under the Nuremberg laws of 1935, any Jewish ancestry, even a single Jewish grandparent in some interpretations, could make a person legally ineligible. The Lebensborn application required women to prove their Aryan lineage through birth and marriage records, a genealogical documentation requirement that could go back to 1800. Personal character evaluation was somewhat more flexible, but still formalized. Women were expected to demonstrate what evaluators described as moral reliability, which in practice meant that they were not engaged in what the regime considered asocial behavior. They were not involved with criminal records, and they demonstrated willingness to align with National Socialist values. This last criterion gave considerable discretion to individual SS evaluators. Georg Lilienthal's analysis of surviving admission records indicates that rejection rates were not trivial. Many women who applied to Lebensborn homes were turned away, not because of their circumstances, but because they did not meet the racial or hereditary criteria. This rejection in itself tells us something important. The selection process was real, enforced, and not merely symbolic. Understanding the selection criteria in the abstract is one thing. Seeing how they were applied in practice, inside the actual Lebensborn homes, is another. By the time World War II ended, the Lebensborn organization had established approximately 10 homes in Germany and Austria, and additional homes in occupied territories, most notably in Norway. The German homes included facilities in Bavaria, Westphalia, and the Rhineland. Their names were often pastoral and romanticized, names like Heim Hochland in Bavaria and Heim Friesland in Lower Saxony. A woman seeking admission to a Lebensborn home went through a multi-stage process. First, she submitted an application, often through an SS officer who was the father of her child, or through a party organization such as the National Socialist Welfare Network. The application triggered an evaluation by the local Russia office. The Russia official would conduct a personal interview and physical examination. A trained evaluator, usually with some background in medicine or what passed for racial science, would assess the woman against the criteria described in the previous chapter. This examination was thorough and intrusive by any standard, involving detailed measurements, photographic documentation in some cases, and comprehensive questioning about family history. If the initial evaluation was favorable, the application went to a higher level of review in the Russia chain of command. Final decisions on admission were documented in the organizational records that Himmler's office maintained. The historian Katrine Clay and journalist Michael Liepman wrote about this administrative machinery in their book, Master Race: The Lebensborn Experiment in Nazi Germany, published by Hodder and Stoughton in 1995, drawing on interviews with survivors and declassified records. Inside the homes themselves, conditions were, by the standards of wartime Germany, genuinely comfortable. This is not said to romanticize anything. It is said because the comfort was itself part of the design. The homes had private or semi-private rooms, good food by wartime standards, medical care, and staff who treated the residents with what was described as respect and dignity, so long as one operated within the framework of being a racially approved mother. Mothers were not obligated to identify the fathers of their children. This was actually a deliberate policy, particularly important for unmarried women, who would otherwise have faced significant social stigma. Himmler explicitly wanted to destigmatize unmarried motherhood for racially approved women, because his demographic anxiety made him willing to challenge the conventional morality that was suppressing birth rates among the women he considered valuable. This is one of the genuinely paradoxical aspects of the program. Lebensborn, in its German iteration, was in some ways socially progressive on the question of unmarried motherhood, while being simultaneously built on a foundation of violent racial exclusion. The benefit of destigmatization was deliberately extended only to those who met the criteria of racial approval. Everyone else remained subject to conventional social condemnation, and those deemed racially undesirable faced far worse than social condemnation under the Nazi state. After birth, mothers could choose to keep their children or surrender them to the Lebensborn organization for placement with approved families. The organization maintained records intended to allow children to know their origins, though, as we will see, this aspect of the design broke down catastrophically as the war progressed, and records were destroyed. The children born in Lebensborn homes were given official documentation, certifying their racial status. They were registered in a way that would, in theory, protect them from any stigma of illegitimacy. They were, in the eyes of the SS, the vanguard of the future Germany. If you have found yourself disturbed by what you have read so far, good. That is the appropriate response. And if you want to make sure you do not miss the next chapter, where we get into the occupied territories and where this program took a significantly darker turn, this is probably a good moment to make sure you are subscribed, not because some algorithm demands it, but because the story we are telling here is one that genuinely deserves to be followed to its conclusion. History, this specific and this important, does not get told in a single sitting. If the German Lebensborn program was disturbing in its bureaucratic precision, what happened in occupied Norway represented something categorically different in its coercive scope, even while operating under the same institutional framework. Norway was occupied by Nazi Germany in April 1940, following Operation Flesserbung. Himmler had a particular obsession with Norwegians, whom he considered among the most purely Nordic people in Europe, precisely the genetic material his demographic project craved. He reportedly referred to Norway as the most Nordic country and saw its population as an ideal source for the racial breeding program he envisioned. The logistics of Lebensborn in Norway were overseen initially by the SS, with the first Norwegian home, Hurdal Verk, opening in 1941. By the end of the war, there were at least 9 Lebensborn homes operating in Norway. Approximately 12,000 children were born to Norwegian mothers and German fathers during the occupation, of whom an estimated 8,000 had contact with the Lebensborn organization. The context of these relationships is a subject of significant historical complexity and ongoing scholarly debate. Some were relationships that women entered into voluntarily, at least by any conventional understanding of the term, though the nature of consent under foreign military occupation is itself deeply complicated. Some were relationships that involved varying degrees of coercion, and some were, without ambiguity, assaults. Norwegian historian Crea Olsen's book, Krigens Barn, translated as Children of the War, published in Norway in 1998 and subsequently in scholarly discussions in English, is the definitive Norwegian language account of what happened to the children born from these unions. Olsen's meticulous research, based on government archives and personal testimonies, documents both the operation of the Lebensborn homes and the devastating post-war treatment of the mothers and children involved. The selection criteria applied in Norway were the same as those applied in Germany. The racial and hereditary health assessments conducted by Russia officials attached to the SS command in Norway. Norwegian women who became pregnant by German soldiers could apply to Lebensborn homes, and they underwent the same evaluative process. Given Himmler's view of Norwegians as racially desirable, rejection rates for Norwegian applicants were reportedly lower than in some other contexts, though the evaluative process was still applied. What made Norway different was scale and context. The presence of an occupying military force fundamentally changed the power dynamics in ways that make the word selection deeply inadequate. When a German soldier fathered a child with a Norwegian woman, the woman existed within a system of total military and administrative control exercised by Nazi Germany. Her options were profoundly constrained by that context. For the Norwegian women who gave birth in Lebensborn homes, the immediate experience was often one of relative care and comfort, similar to the German homes. But the post-war experience was catastrophic. Norway's post-war treatment of these women and their children represents one of the most documented cases of systematic post-war persecution of civilians in Western Europe. The children born of German fathers, known in Norwegian as Tyskerunge or Tyskerbarn, German children or German brats, faced systematic discrimination enforced at the institutional level. Norwegian authorities attempted to deport many of these children to Germany or to Sweden, actions documented in government archives and analyzed in the 2008 Norwegian government report on the treatment of war children, Statens behandling av krigsbarna, commissioned by the Ministry of Justice. Many of these children were placed in institutions for the mentally ill or intellectually disabled, without any clinical justification, a practice documented by the Norwegian attorney Anne Merete Hoge and by journalist Ebba Hasland's earlier work. Some were subjected to abuse within these institutions. The Norwegian government formally acknowledged and apologized for this treatment in 2005. The story of what happened to these children, a story of being selected first for a racial breeding program by one regime and then persecuted for that selection by their own country afterward, is one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the entire history of Lebensborn. If Norway represented a troubling chapter in the history of Lebensborn, the occupied Eastern territories represent the program's most overtly criminal dimension. Because in the East, particularly in Poland and the Soviet Union, selection became, without any euphemism available, systematic kidnapping. The operational logic here followed from the same ideological premises as the rest of the program, but it dispensed with any pretense of voluntary participation. If the goal was to increase the number of racially desirable children within the German racial community, and if racially desirable children were found living within populations that had been conquered and subjected to brutal occupation, then the solution, according to the perverted logic of Nazi racial ideology, was to take those children. This was organized under a broader initiative called Germanization, or Eindeutschung, the forcible cultural and eventually biological absorption of people deemed racially suitable from conquered populations into the German racial community. Himmler articulated this policy explicitly in a May 1940 memorandum entitled Some Thoughts on the Treatment of the Alien Population in the East, in which he described the extraction of racially valuable children from Eastern populations as a priority. The operational implementation involved SS units and auxiliary organizations conducting what were essentially raids on villages and communities in occupied Poland, Yugoslavia, Ukraine, and other territories. Children were assessed on the spot, or sometimes gathered and assessed in more organized collection points, using visual racial criteria. Children who appeared to match Nordic racial criteria based on physical appearance were separated from their families. The Jerzy Mazur Center for Research and Documentation of Nazism in Poland has documented cases of this process in detail, drawing on both German administrative records and Polish survivor testimonies. The Polish historian Kazimierz Radziwiłł and others have worked to compile evidence of the scale of these kidnappings, which targeted children predominantly in the age range of 2 to 12 years. Once selected, children were placed in Germanization facilities where they were subjected to a process of cultural erasure. Their names were changed to German names. Speaking Polish or their native language was forbidden and could be punished. They were taught that they were German, that their families were not their real families, or in some cases they were told their families had died. They were then placed with German SS families or adoptive families through the Lebensborn administrative network. The scale of this operation was enormous. The most frequently cited figure from post-war scholarship is that somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 children were taken from Poland alone, with some estimates running higher. The Polish government's post-war investigations, conducted under the auspices of the Central Commission for the Investigation of German Crimes in Poland, documented thousands of individual cases. The broader figure, across all occupied territories, has been estimated as high as several 100,000 children. The Nuremberg Tribunal addressed this program explicitly. In the judgment against Ulrich Grefeld, the head of the Reich Commissariat for the Strengthening of German Nationhood, and other defendants in Case 8, the so-called Russia case, the tribunal found that the forcible transfer of children from occupied populations to Germany constituted a crime against humanity and a war crime. The Russia case judgment, part of the published record of the subsequent Nuremberg trials available through Yale Law School's Avalon Project, is one of the most detailed legal analyses of these operations in existence. Grefeld and his co-defendants were convicted. The verdicts established legal precedent that child abduction for purposes of racial or ethnic transformation constituted criminal conduct under international law. This precedent contributed to the eventual codification of genocide in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. The tragedy of the kidnapped children did not end with liberation. After the war, identifying and repatriating these children proved enormously difficult. Many had been so thoroughly Germanized that they had no memory of their birth families or their original identities. Polish language records were destroyed. German administrative records were incomplete or had been deliberately falsified. Organizations like the International Tracing Service struggled for years to reunite children with surviving family members. Some of these children never learned their true origins. Some discovered the truth only decades later as adults, sometimes through DNA testing in the 21st century. The Polish Remembrance and the Future Foundation has continued work on tracing these cases, and as recently as the 2010s, individuals have discovered in their 70s and 80s that their entire biographical identity had been constructed by the SS in the 1940s. This is the point where I want to pause and acknowledge something directly. The story we are telling contains elements of historical record that are so extreme, they can begin to feel abstract, numbers and policies and administrative structures rather than human experiences. But every one of those kidnapped children was a specific person, taken from specific parents, given a false name, told a false story about who they were. The administrative machinery of selection that we have been analyzing was the mechanism through which these individual human tragedies were generated at industrial scale. If you know someone who would benefit from understanding this history, this would be a genuinely good time to share this video with them, not because sharing videos helps algorithms, but because this is the kind of history that has direct relevance to understanding how states can weaponize bureaucracy against human beings. And that understanding is not optional for people who want to engage seriously with the present. Tap the like button too, not because your approval feeds a machine, but because it genuinely helps this content reach people who are looking for exactly this kind of historical analysis. No account of the Lebensborn selection process is complete without examining the role of medicine, because the selection machinery did not operate without medical professionals who provided it with scientific legitimacy and operational capacity. The involvement of German medicine in Nazi racial programs is one of the most extensively documented dimensions of this history. Robert Lifton's landmark study, The Nazi Doctor's Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide, published by Basic Books in 1986, remains the most comprehensive psychological and historical analysis of how doctors integrated into systems of racial selection and killing. Lifton's interviews with surviving Nazi physicians, conducted over many years, reveal the ideological and psychological mechanisms by which medical professionals rationalized their participation in programs that violated every fundamental principle of medical ethics. Within the Lebensborn program specifically, doctors served multiple functions. They conducted the physical examinations that assessed women against racial criteria. They evaluated hereditary health claims and family medical histories. They provided obstetric care within the homes. And they participated in the post-birth assessment of children to confirm their racial rating. The racial assessment of children was a particularly troubling medical function. Children born within Lebensborn homes, or children identified for Germanization in occupied territories, were evaluated using a scoring system developed by racial scientists within the SS. The Nuremberg Military Tribunal's Doctors' Trial, officially United States versus Karl Brandt et al., heard evidence about the medical dimensions of these programs, and the trial record, available through the National Archives, documents the specific methodologies employed. The physicians who conducted racial assessments were not, for the most part, marginal or unqualified practitioners. Many held academic positions at German universities. Some had published in peer-reviewed medical journals. The institutional capture of German medicine by Nazi ideology was total enough that racial selection work was carried out by mainstream medical practitioners operating within conventional professional frameworks. One of the most detailed accounts of how this worked in practice comes from the documentary work around the Auschwitz selections, which, while not part of Lebensborn directly, used the same trained cadre of physicians who had been conditioned by years of working within the racial selection framework. Joseph Mengele, who has become the most notorious symbol of Nazi medical evil, began his career in research that overlapped with the racial science apparatus that fed into programs like Lebensborn. The gynecological and obstetric dimensions of the Lebensborn homes were managed by physicians who understood their role within the racial project. These doctors monitored pregnancies, delivered children, and participated in the assessment of newborns. Children deemed insufficiently racially valuable after birth were not, in the German homes, killed, a crucial distinction from the euthanasia programs operating simultaneously elsewhere. But they might be denied the documentation and status afforded to fully approved Lebensborn children. In the context of occupied territories, particularly Poland, medical personnel participated in the selection of children for Germanization. Physical examinations conducted under conditions of military occupation, often without consent or comprehension on the part of the children or their families, determined which children were taken and which were left. The doctors conducting these examinations were not passive participants. They were active agents in a selection process that they understood would result in the permanent separation of children from their families. The historian Michael Burleigh, in his book Death and Deliverance, Euthanasia in Germany, 1900 to 1945, published by Cambridge University Press in 1994, traces the ideological continuum that connected positive eugenics programs like Lebensborn with the negative eugenics of forced sterilization and ultimately with the euthanasia killings. The same medical infrastructure served all three functions. The same ideological framework justified all three. The doctors who participated in Lebensborn selections were operating within the same system that also produced medical murder. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the medical dimension of this history. The corruption of medicine by ideology did not happen suddenly or obviously. It happened gradually, through a series of steps each of which could be individually rationalized, until physicians found themselves conducting racial assessments of children taken from their parents, and considered this to be legitimate medical practice. We have spent considerable time on the machinery of selection, the criteria, the institutions, the doctors, the administrators. Now we need to stay with the human consequences, specifically what happened to the children who were the ostensible purpose of the entire program. The children of Lebensborn, whether born in the German homes or kidnapped from occupied territories, share certain elements of a common experience: a childhood shaped by an institutional lie, the lie of racial selection, and in many cases, an adult life spent trying to recover an identity that was taken from them. For the children born in German Lebensborn homes, the experience depended significantly on whether they were raised by their biological mothers, placed with adoptive families, or, in some cases, placed in institutional care when neither option materialized. The Lebensborn organization maintained a child welfare function that, by the standards of the time, provided reasonable care, but the entire framework of that care was built on racial categorization and the specific ideological purposes of the SS. As the war ended and the Nazi state collapsed, the organizational infrastructure that had maintained these children's records collapsed with it. Himmler ordered the destruction of Lebensborn records in the final weeks of the war, a deliberate act to conceal the program's existence and scope. Much was destroyed. Some records survived because of the speed of Allied advances, or because individual administrators failed to complete the destruction, or because copies existed in multiple locations. The post-war legal status of Lebensborn was adjudicated at Nuremberg in the Russia case. The Lebensborn organization itself was not found to be a criminal organization in the formal legal sense, a verdict that has been criticized by subsequent historians. The tribunal found insufficient evidence that the homes themselves, as distinct from the kidnapping programs conducted under the broader Germanization umbrella, constituted criminal enterprises. This legal distinction, while technically defensible given the evidence standards applied at Nuremberg, has contributed to a persistent underappreciation of the program's scope and harm. For the children born in German homes, the post-war challenge was primarily one of identity. Many had been born to unmarried mothers and registered with modified or falsified parentage information to protect the mothers from social stigma. When these records were incomplete or destroyed, children had no way to determine their biological fathers, their hereditary medical histories, or in some cases their birth names. The organization Lebensspuren Life Traces, founded in Germany to support adults who discovered or suspected they were Lebensborn children, has documented hundreds of cases of individuals who spent decades seeking their true origins. Many of these searches remained incomplete because the records simply no longer exist. For the children kidnapped from occupied territories, the situation was categorically worse. Many of these children, Germanized under false identities, discovered their origins only as adults. Sometimes only after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe opened archives that had been inaccessible. Polish, Czech, and Yugoslav archives, when opened in the 1990s, revealed documentation that allowed some individuals to trace their origins for the first time. The experience of these individuals, discovering in middle or old age that their entire biographical identity was a construction of the SS, is documented in memoirs and journalistic accounts. The journalist Isabel Vincent's work and the documentary Children of Lebensborn, directed by Harold Scheuermann, have recorded these testimonies. What emerges from them is a portrait of identity theft so profound that recovery, in any complete sense, may be impossible. Some of these individuals, knowing they had been kidnapped, searched for surviving birth families. In some cases, they found relatives. In others, their original families had been entirely destroyed in the war, killed in the Holocaust, or in the genocidal campaigns against Slavic populations that accompanied Nazi occupation. To discover not only that your identity was stolen, but that the family from whom it was stolen no longer exists to be found, is a particular and devastating species of loss. We have now walked through the historical record of how the Lebensborn program worked, how women were selected, how the criteria were applied, how the program expanded from Germany to occupied territories, how medical professionals enabled it, and what happened to the children it produced and kidnapped. This final chapter, before our conclusion, is where I want to offer something different, not just historical documentation, but honest, critical analysis of what this history means and why it matters in ways that extend beyond the specific horrors of the Nazi period. The first thing that needs to be said directly is that the Lebensborn program was not an aberration or an anomaly in the history of modernity. It was an extreme expression of tendencies that were present in the mainstream scientific and political culture of its time. Eugenics was not a fringe ideology in the 1930s. It was taught in universities across the democratic world. It shaped immigration policy in the United States. It informed marriage legislation in multiple countries. The Nazi version was more radical, more systematically applied, and incomparably more violent than anything attempted elsewhere. But it drew on intellectual sources that were not uniquely German. This matters because one of the psychological defenses available to us when we study this history is the comfort of radical othering, the idea that this was something so alien to normal human psychology and normal institutional behavior that it requires some unique explanation rooted in specifically German or specifically Nazi pathology. That comfort is historically dishonest. The institutions that enabled Lebensborn, the medical apparatus, the bureaucratic structures, the academic framework, were recognizable versions of institutions that exist in every modern society. The historian Zygmunt Bauman argued in his book Modernity and the Holocaust, published by Cornell University Press in 1989, that the Holocaust, including its eugenic dimensions, was not a breakdown of modern civilization, but, in important respects, an expression of it. The combination of bureaucratic organization, scientific rationalization, and ideological purpose that produced Lebensborn is not a primitive phenomenon. It is a thoroughly modern one. And that is a significantly more disturbing conclusion than the idea that it was simply the product of monsters operating outside normal human psychology. The second critical observation is about the role of science. The pseudo-science of Nazi racial classification was fraudulent, but it was administered by real scientists operating within real institutions using real methodologies. What made it fraudulent was not the absence of rigor, but the corruption of rigor by ideological purpose. The researchers who developed racial measurement systems believed they were doing science. The physicians who applied those systems in selection examinations believed they were applying scientific medicine. The ideological capture of science did not require scientists to stop thinking scientifically. It required only that their research questions, their interpretive frameworks, and their institutional incentives be shaped by the ideological purposes of the state. This has implications that are not purely historical. The history of Lebensborn should make us permanently suspicious of scientific claims that conveniently align with existing social hierarchies and power structures, not because science itself is corrupt, but because scientists are not immune to the institutional and ideological pressures that shape all human activity. The peer review process, independent replication, and genuine intellectual diversity within scientific communities are not bureaucratic formalities. They are safeguards against exactly the kind of corruption that produced Nazi racial science. The third critical point concerns the treatment of the children after the war. What happened to the Lebensborn children in Norway? The systematic institutional abuse, the labeling as mentally deficient without clinical justification, the dehumanization by the same society that was supposed to protect them, demonstrates something important about how societies process the trauma of atrocity. The Norwegian government's 2005 apology, while meaningful and necessary, came 60 years too late for the individuals whose childhoods were destroyed by it. And the mechanisms by which Norwegian society persecuted these children were not mysterious. They were the mechanisms of ordinary social prejudice, amplified by institutional power, directed at people who were visually associated with the enemy. The children of German soldiers were punished for the crime of their paternity, which they did not choose and could not change. This tells us something about how scapegoating functions in the aftermath of collective trauma. When a society experiences something as devastating as military occupation, the desire to identify and punish those associated with the oppressor can override every commitment to the protection of the innocent. The children were not guilty of anything. They were, by definition, incapable of guilt, but they were available, visible, and associated with a collective wound, and so they were punished. The fourth critical point is about documentation and its destruction. Himmler's order to destroy Lebensborn records in the final weeks of the war was not simply an act of criminal concealment, though it was that. It was also an act of additional violence against the people whose identities were recorded in those documents. Every record destroyed was a human identity that could not be recovered. Every name burned was a person who would spend their life unable to fully know who they were. The deliberate destruction of records as a weapon against survivors is a pattern that appears in genocide and mass atrocity contexts beyond the Nazi period. The destruction of census records, birth certificates, and genealogical documentation is a way of attacking not only individuals but communities, severing connections between generations, making it impossible for survivors and their descendants to reconstruct what was taken from them. The story of Lebensborn is told incompletely in popular culture, and that incomplete telling has consequences. The image of Lebensborn as primarily a voluntary breeding program between ideologically committed SS men and willing women misses the kidnapping, the coercion, the institutional power dynamics of occupation, and the devastating consequences for the children who became its products and its victims. The story is also sometimes told in a way that extracts it from its ideological context, treating it as a curiosity of Nazi extremism rather than as an extreme expression of ideas that were continuous with broader currents of modern thought. That decontextualized telling makes it easier to dismiss as unrepeatable when in fact the underlying logic, the logic that certain human lives are more valuable than others, and that society should engineer reproduction accordingly, has never fully disappeared from human thought. The woman who appeared before an SS examiner with her measurements being taken, and her genealogical records being scrutinized, was not encountering something alien to modernity. She was encountering modernity's darkest capacity, the application of bureaucratic rationality to the most intimate dimensions of human life in service of ideological goals that denied her full humanity, regardless of whether she was approved or rejected. The child kidnapped from a Polish village and renamed with a German name was not encountering something outside the scope of modern state power. The state's capacity to reorganize populations according to ideological criteria, to rewrite individual identities through administrative action, is a capacity that has been exercised in different ways by different regimes. What the Nazis did was an extreme version, but the capacity itself is not unique to them. Understanding this history with full accuracy, including the selection criteria, the institutional machinery, the medical apparatus, the scope of the kidnapping programs, and the post-war treatment of the survivors, is not an academic exercise. It is one of the most practically important things a historically literate person can do. The scholars whose work we have drawn on throughout this video, Georg Lilienthal, Kersti Eriksson, Kre Olsen, Robert Lifton, Michael Burley, Katrine Clay, and Michael Liepman, among others, have spent careers making this record as complete and accurate as possible. Their work is available, it is documented, and it is exactly the kind of historical scholarship that deserves wider engagement than it typically receives. The survivors of this program, the women who were evaluated and either approved or rejected, the children born in the homes, and above all, the children who were taken from their families in occupied territories, deserve to have their experiences understood accurately and with full acknowledgement of the wrong done to them. The ones who are still living, increasingly elderly, and the ones who did not survive to see a full accounting of what happened to them. History, this specific and this important, does not retain its power to inform and warn us if we allow it to become myth. The myth of Lebensborn as a strange Nazi breeding cult is comfortable because it is distant. The reality of Lebensborn as a bureaucratic operation, applying pseudo-scientific racial criteria through institutional machinery staffed by ordinary professionals, is uncomfortable because it is recognizable. Let it be uncomfortable. That discomfort is doing exactly what it should do. If you have watched this entire video, you have engaged with one of the more challenging chapters in 20th century history, and you have done so with the kind of sustained attention it deserves. That matters. And if there is something in what you have heard today that you find yourself thinking about, arguing with, or wanting to know more about, I genuinely want to hear from you. Drop a comment below with what struck you most, whether it is the selection criteria themselves, the treatment of the children after the war, the role of medical professionals in the program, or the critical questions about modernity and ideology that this history raises. This is the kind of subject that genuinely benefits from conversation, and the comment section here is a place where that conversation can be substantive. The books referenced in this video, Lilienthal's Der Lebensborn e.V., Lifton's The Nazi Doctors, Baumann's Modernity and the Holocaust, Olsen's Kriegens Barn, Burley's Death and Deliverance, Clay and Liepman's Master Race, and the published Nuremberg trial records available through Yale's Avalon Project, are all worth your time if you want to go deeper. They represent decades of serious historical work that this video has only been able to summarize. The record is there, the evidence is documented, the history is real. And the question of what we do with that understanding, how we apply it to the present, how we build the kind of institutional, scientific, and civic safeguards that make it harder for this to happen again in any form, is not a question that history alone can answer. It is a question that belongs to us right now in the world we are actually living in. That is the work, and it does not end when the video does.